When I was about 10 years old, my grandfather gave me a little snow globe that his great-grandmother had given him when he was about the same age. Inside it was the Lone Ranger, the iconic Western hero who traveled on a white horse named Silver with his friend Tonto, wearing a mask to conceal his identity. It's appropriate because only in a fictional world could a cloth mask actually protect someone's well-being. But I had really never heard of the figure before, so my grandpa told me to watch the old TV series starring Clayton Moore. I was inspired by the character's commitment to bringing criminals to justice, and the show taught me a valuable lesson. It is very easy to saddle up and ride, but it is very difficult to do so effectively. Many of us know the story. A group of Texas Rangers is trying to bring a group of ruthless criminals known as the Cavendish Gang to justice. They trust a civilian guide named Collins to lead them to the gang, but he leads them into an ambush instead, leaving all but one of them dead. That survivor creates a mask out of the vest that belonged to his brother, the leader of the Rangers, and he vows to turn criminals over to the law alive. He chooses to trust in a person and an institution whose flaws nearly got him killed. His brother made the mistake of trusting Collins, allowing the Rangers to be led into the ambush. The loose justice system allowed the Cavendish Gang to run wild in the first place, putting his fellow Rangers in danger. Both his brother and the law failed him, but he chose not to reject them, instead choosing to take a physical reminder of his brother's lessons and leadership with him in his mask, and vowing not to kill any of the criminals that he's fighting, instead allowing the criminal justice system to give out punishment. This is the prime difference between left-wing and conservative activism. The left sees the flaws in our institutions and those who built them, and their first instinct is to tear them down. Conservatives know it is much easier to tear things down than it is to build them back up. Although our institutions are flawed, they're still good, and we are unlikely to do much better ourselves. When we saddle up and ride, we take with us the knowledge of those who came before. We've seen this dichotomy play out most recently in the debate over critical race theory. We are told by the left that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are evil documents, and that the system that they created is fruit of the poisonous tree due to the presence of slavery at the time of the founding. This is actually not a new idea. We have seen both good and evil people make the claim throughout American history that the Constitution spawned slavery. We have held this debate in three major periods: the Revolution itself, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights era. In all three of those times, the greatest warriors for freedom, for justice, for equality were those that when they saddle up and ride, they look back. Back to the founding of our country, back to the founding documents, and back to the principles that they contain. We're told by the left that Great Britain actually abolished slavery decades before America did. While this is technically true regarding the whole country, it's missing context. The first time an active legislature abolished slavery in a specific territory was actually in the United States. Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in 1780. It was the first time in human history that people elected their representatives, and those representatives got together and they said, slavery is a moral abomination, we don't want it in our state. And it happened right here in America. Why? Well, if we read the preamble to the act, it becomes clear that the American Revolution inspired the abolition. They write that when they contemplate their abhorrence of that condition to which the arms and tyranny of Britain were exerted to reduce them, then they conceive that it is their duty, and rejoice that it is in their power to extend a portion of that freedom to others, which hath been extended to them. Their mistreatment at the hands of King George made them cognizant of others who were in a state of unjust subordination, and that led them to take American slaves out of that subordination. The Revolution inspired Pennsylvania and many other northern states toward abolition, but other portions of our country did not entirely live up to the tenets of the founding. So we had to fight a bloody civil war to finally eradicate slavery from our borders. Many secessionists argued that the purpose of the Constitution was to protect a state's right to hold slaves. John C. Calhoun said that slavery was an essential element of the distribution of the Constitution's powers among the states. When the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union, it called out free states whose anti-slavery efforts, in their words, ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. Now, it wasn't only the bad guys who were making this argument. William Lloyd Garrison was the founder of what would become the abolitionist movement in America, and we owe him a lot for that. But that doesn't mean that his methods were perfect. In an 1854 speech, he said that the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and he actually burned a copy of the Constitution as he said this. Now, many of his fellow abolitionists thought that his attacks on the founding were counterproductive. Among them, Frederick Douglass. Douglass gave a famous speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in which he called out the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom while also keeping millions of souls in chains. Now, the left loves this speech, or at least they pretend to, because Douglass denounces conditions within America. But funny enough, they only quote the first half of it. That's because the second half is filled with appeals to the Constitution. Douglass calls it a glorious liberty document and says that there is not a single pro-slavery clause in it, and that its principles are entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. He was joined in his love for the founding by President Abraham Lincoln. You all know that in his famous Gettysburg Address, he said that America was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He then pays that line off by telling his audience that the efforts to abolish slavery will give America a new birth of freedom. Lincoln and Frederick Douglass knew that the way to make America better was to appeal to the founding, and they took its principles with them as they saddled up and rode against the evils of slavery. But they did not fully complete their work, as the evils of racial segregation still persisted in the former slave states. The fight for equality within the civil rights era teaches us similar lessons about taking the founding with us in our fight for freedom. George Wallace, the face of the segregationist movement, argued that the Constitution had a racist purpose. In his Segregation Now, Segregation Forever speech, he steeped himself in the tradition of Confederates like Jefferson Davis. When he brought up patriots like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, he did so only in focusing on their slave ownership, much like the critical race theorists of today. His polar opposite, Malcolm X, made similar arguments in his pursuit of black nationalism. He said in an interview that the Constitution was created by whites for the benefit of whites, not for the benefit of blacks. Again, we have two people arguing for diametrically opposed goals, and yet they're using the exact same arguments. But as the country learned 100 years before, the Constitution is good, and the best warriors for liberty will recognize that, as did a certain Martin Luther King Jr. His shining moment was in his "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he said that the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It was modern America's responsibility, King said, to make sure that that promissory note was fulfilled. And he did, because he knew that the American founding was good. All these great people succeeded because they took with them the lessons and the institutions of those who came before, much like the Lone Ranger did in making his mask from his brother's vest and trusting the law to restore justice. We can learn from him and from the great patriots throughout history. When we saddle up and ride, we have all of them riding behind us, and we can look back at them for inspiration. We must not cast them off like the left does. We must carry them with us as we ride. When the Lone Ranger looks over at the graves of his friends, he says, "For every one of those men, I'm going to bring 100 criminals to justice." It reminded me of another section of the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln says that the honored dead had consecrated the ground of the battlefield far more than he could. It was for us, the living, he said, to carry on their unfinished work. Well, now we are the living. Washington, Lincoln, King, and their contemporaries made this country better for us, and we have a responsibility to do the same for our posterity on race relations and all other issues. It is time for us to saddle up and ride, and we must do so subservient to the wisdom of our ancestors, as William F. Buckley said. We have stood athwart history yelling stop. Now, let's make history. Let's move forward by looking back. Let's create a country our forefathers would be proud of. Thank you.